So in this video I want to talk a little bit about cameras and lensing. And as we can see in this example here in the slate, the lens has a profound impact on the image. So this is the same shot or the same location, and the only thing that's really changing the proximity to this concrete block and the focal length. All right, so we're in a After Effects class, of course, and we're going to be using 2.5D images, but it's good to just kind of talk about lenses here in a kind of proper 3D environment. So I'm using Maya, and what I have here is just a cube and the default grid, and I have a camera. All right, so let's start. The focal length that kind of matches our eyesight, it's kind of neutral, is 50 millimeters. And as we go lower, we create more distortion and more immersion, more of a sense of space. So, also where you position the camera kind of tricks your brain into thinking something's kind of bigger or smaller. But see, as I go more extreme, this cube gets bigger and bigger. It feels bigger and bigger. There's more distortion. There's more kind of perspective. On the other end of the spectrum so that's a wide angle. On the other end of the spectrum is telephoto. And the longer the lens gets here, the more kind of graphic and idealized. Well, let's take it to an extreme. So the most extreme kind of version of this is what is called an orthographic view. So let's make a new front, and then we'll... So here in my orthographic view, if I spin around, the square becomes, we kind of abandon perspective altogether, and anything that is a parallel line in the real world is also a parallel line in my image. It's more like idealized. We're kind of like, I like to just think about it as like observational. You're kind of looking at something as an object, versus the other extreme is kind of immersive. You're treating you're kind of treating it as like a space that you're moving in, and you're making it kind of more dramatic. So, all right, so that's the same that's the same object, but of course it looks very, very different based on the position of the camera and the lensing. So to kind of see some like examples in photography, Andreas Feininger would, he became really famous for his use of a telephoto lens, a long focal length, a high number, and what that does is it kind of compresses the space. And so for him, it makes the New York City seem even more crowded and condensed because he's kind of flattening and compressing the image into a single space. He's using a long lens. And here we see this too, right? There's not a lot of perspective. There's not a lot of vanishing point happening on that road down there. This also has like kind of a big impact on portraits, of course. So the lower focal lengths, the wider lenses, introduces distortion in the image. So you can see that in the upper left, kind of a less idealized version of the face, whereas the bottom right like really flattens it out. It's almost like a how to describe it? You see longer focal lengths a lot in fashion photography. You tend not to have wide lenses for portraiture, but I'll show you an example of where you would do that to like make the viewer uneasy to have more distortion. So on the extreme of the telephoto, of course, we have orthographic. We see this a lot in video games and blueprints and that sort of thing. This is like a still from SimCity. And we also tend to see longer focal lengths for product stuff because once again, it idealizes the object. It doesn't. You're kind of looking at it from afar, and there's no distortion in the object. So both in portraiture and in product photography, we tend to see longer focal lengths. On the other end of the spectrum, we have wide angles, and what that does is it creates like a lot of depth, a lot of distortion, and a huge sense of scale in space. So here's this Eiffel Tower over here. And then here's a movie that I love called Delicatessen, where the filmmakers, subverting expectations of how you're supposed to shoot talent. But this is a movie you should watch it. I don't want to give away the big twist here, but it's meant to be kind of make you uneasy and kind of immerse you in the space and make the characters seem a little bit surreal and distorted and otherworldly. And part of the way they're kind of achieving that is lensing it really wide, adding a lot of distortion to the plate. All right, so let's head back over to After Effects, and in the scene here we are just using the default camera, but we can of course make our own. So let's make a new camera. And here we see these options, right? We can do a wider camera to have more distortion, or a longer camera to have less. So we're trying to create the illusion of space. So let's go with a 24. And so you can see right away that made this feel kind of bigger. And maybe we'll just show you the difference. So that's 24. And we'll make a new camera. Make this 200. And the camera that's on the top is the one you're going to see. So you can kind of edit between different cameras on the fly, which is kind of cool. So here's a default camera. That's the 24, a little more distortion, and then that's the telephoto, which makes it more orthographic. All right, so the other thing, so let's just zero this thing out here. All right, so we're back to our default view. And we have our cameras. And there's two kinds of cameras that you can play with in After Effects. And basically the different types of cameras are how you control the movement of the camera. So what I would recommend for our project here is a one node camera. And I would only play with the translation. I wouldn't play with the rotation of the camera at all for this project. But let me just show you, if you do want to create a camera that has more of an orbital kind of move, you use a two-node camera. So let's do that. And how that works is there's a position and then there's a point of interest. And so the point of interest, so you know what, another thing we can do to kind of just show this a little better is right now we just have one view, which is the active camera, but we can actually look at the scene from two different points of view at once. So this one is our default, and then this one is our new active camera, but we can look at this from the top, from the right, from whatever. And what that does is that lets us kind of see what's going on in our scene. All right, so here we're looking at it from the top. There's our midground, background, foreground. Here's our camera. All right, and then this is our point of interest. So this is where we're looking. And what that'll let us do is if we move our camera in X, let me zoom out a little. Actually, you know what? Let's just make a wider angle camera. New camera, just so it'll be easier to deal with. 2-node camera, 20 millimeters. Alrighty, here we go. Alright, and here's my 2-node camera, and as I move this thing, the pivot, the viewpoint remains the same. So that's good for orbiting around stuff, right? But if we zoom, so one thing to be careful about though is if we zoom in on this thing, see, what happens is when I go over that point of interest, the camera actually flips around. And as we're approaching the subject, this foreground layer, it does this crazy flippy thing. So anyway, the 2-node camera has its uses, but you should avoid it. So let's, unless you really need it, I think by default, you're going to want to use a 1-node camera, and definitely for this project. You're going to want a 1-node camera, and I would say for now, so instead of a 2-node, we'll do a 1-node. We'll go maybe 24 millimeters. And then what the 1-node camera lets you do, you could push right through. You can push right through this image, and there's not going to be any flips. And the other nice thing about it is it's really nice for parallax, right? That illusion of depth. So it's really good for dollying in and tracking across subjects. It is less good for kind of orbital moves where you're orbiting around a center of interest. But you know, in After Effects, it's a 2.5D space, so I find if you're really orbiting around something, you're going to give away the illusion of it being 2.5D, of this being paper cutout. So, you know, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a 1-node camera, and definitely for this homework project, I would recommend 1-node. All right, so that's an overview of cameras and lenses.